Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fascinating topic. It's something that sparked a huge debate a few years back and continues to make people think and talk, even today.
Yeah, this one really gets to the heart of some, really big questions about who we are and how we see ourselves and each other.
Exactly. We're talking about race and identity, and specifically the very controversial case of Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who, for years, presented herself as black.
It's a case that really challenges our preconceived notions of race, ethnicity, even the meaning of identity itself.
Absolutely. And it's not just a philosophical debate either. There were real-world consequences for Dolezal and for the people around her.
Right. It really forced society to grapple with some incredibly complex and uncomfortable issues. So should we start with a quick recap of Dolezal's story, for those who might need a refresher?
Yeah, good idea. So Rachel Dolezal first came into the public eye as a chapter president of the NAACP.
And she was also a professor of Africana studies, right? She was deeply involved in issues of racial justice and Black identity.
Exactly, and she was very vocal about her own experiences as a black woman, even alleging hate crimes against her.
But then her parents came forward with some pretty shocking information.
Yeah, the big twist in the story. Her parents revealed that she was actually white.
And that revelation just set off a media firestorm.
It did. Suddenly, she was facing accusations of cultural appropriation, blackface deception.
She was forced to resign from her position at the NAACP, lost her teaching job.
And even faced felony charges related to welfare fraud.
It's amazing how quickly her life unraveled.
It is. But here's the thing. Even after all that, even in the face of all this scrutiny and criticism, she continued to insist on her black identity.
She even went so far as to legally change her name to an African name.
It's a situation that really makes you think, right? Can someone simply choose their race? Is that even possible?
It raises so many questions about the nature of race, ethnicity, and what it even means to identify with a particular group.
Right. And it also makes you wonder about the limits of self-identification. Like, is it okay to identify as something you're not, biologically speaking?
Yeah, like, is this comparable to the idea of transgender identity, where someone's internal sense of gender might not align with their biological sex?
Yeah.
Is that a valid comparison?
So many questions. And to really dig into this, I think we need to start with a basic understanding of what ethnicity even means.
Agreed. So let's turn to our first source, the always helpful Wikipedia, specifically the article on ethnicity.
Okay, so according to Wikipedia, ethnicity is defined as a social group that shares a common and distinctive culture, religion, language, or the like.
And it's important to note that they emphasize that ethnicity is often determined by multiple overlapping aspects, which makes it kind of complicated.
Not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance.
Right. They give the example of Armenian ethnicity. It can be based on citizenship, heritage, language, religious affiliation.
So even with something like ethnicity, we see it's not always a simple, clear-cut category.
Absolutely. There can be so much nuance and complexity layered in there.
And then, of course, we get to the whole concept of race, which is like the central issue in the Dolezal case.
Yeah, this is where things get really, really interesting because it forces us to ask, is race something fixed, determined by our biology?
Or is it something more fluid, more socially constructed, as some people argue?
Exactly. And the Dolezal case really shines a spotlight on that tension between how we traditionally view race versus this idea of self-identification.
Of choosing your own racial identity.
Right. So the question becomes, if someone claims a racial identity that doesn't align with their ancestry, does that automatically mean they're being deceptive?
Or is it possible that race is something that goes beyond biology, that it's something you can genuinely feel and identify with, even if it doesn't match your genetic heritage?
These are tough questions. And honestly, science doesn't have all the answers. But speaking of science, we actually do have a source that touches on this very topic, the Wikipedia article on gene editing.
Oh yeah, this one's fascinating. It talks about how scientists can now trace ancestry through skeletal remains using DNA analysis.
Pretty incredible, right? I mean, think about it. We can literally look into the past and trace the lineage of people who lived centuries ago.
It is mind-blowing. But here's the thing, even with all these advances in genetics, we're still left with this gray area when it comes to race.
Absolutely. Ancestry tests might tell us where our ancestors geographically originated, but they can't conclusively define our race.
So even with all the science at our disposal, it seems like we're still grappling with this fundamental question. What is race?
And that's why the social construct argument becomes so important, especially in a case like Dolezal's.
Because it forces us to consider, if maybe race is more about how society perceives us and categorizes us rather than just our DNA.
And it raises questions about whether our personal experiences, how we see ourselves, our self-identification, if those things play a role in defining our racial identity.
It's like, how much weight do we give to biology versus lived experience? Are they both important, or is one more important than the other?
Really big questions, no easy answers. And you know what? To get a better sense of how people are actually thinking about these issues, we decided to look at some social media discussions.
Yeah, we found some really interesting conversations happening on TikTok and YouTube, and they offer some pretty contrasting perspectives.
And they perfectly illustrate just how divided public opinion is on these topics. So should we dive into those?
Let's do it. I'm curious to see what people are saying.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Dolezal case just ignited this huge debate. I mean, some people were just outraged, you know? They saw her actions as like deeply offensive, a blatant form of cultural appropriation, or even, blackface.
It's like that clash of perspectives that makes this so fascinating to really unpack. I mean, for a lot of people, and especially within the Black community, Dolezal's actions were seen as like deeply hurtful, disrespectful. It wasn't just about like darkening your skin and changing your hair texture. Although, I mean, those actions definitely evoked painful memories of racist caricature mockery.
Yeah, and I think the deeper issue for a lot of people was that, by claiming this Black identity, Dolezal was maybe taking opportunities or platforms away from actual Black women who have, lived the experience of being Black in America.
It's like she was trying to kind of benefit from a system of oppression that she hadn't really truly experienced,
Yeah.
which I think felt like a betrayal to a lot of people. And then there's the whole issue of deception, right? I mean, she built her career and reputation on this false narrative, which further eroded trust, especially within the African American community.
For sure, for sure. And it's really important to acknowledge the very real pain and anger caused by her actions. But, as you mentioned, there were also people who offered a different perspective, who even defended her right to self-identify as Black.
Right. So what were the arguments used by those who were kind of defending Dolezal?
Well, some people, like, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for example, they argued that if we're increasingly accepting that, gender identity can be fluid and distinct from biological sex, then shouldn't we apply the same logic to race?
So they're drawing this parallel between transgender identity and what some are calling transracial identity. Like if someone can transition genders, why not races?
Exactly. And that's where things get really, really, really tricky. It's like opening a Pandora's box of philosophical and ethical questions.
Because then where do we draw the line?
Mhm.
If race is purely a social construct, as some argue, does that mean it's just like a matter of personal choice? Can anyone just choose to belong to any racial group they want, regardless of their ancestry or lived experience?
And what about, the cultural and historical baggage associated with different racial groups? Can someone simply opt into a racial identity without, acknowledging or understanding the struggles of triumphs that come with it?
Yeah, it's like we're caught in this tangled web of, competing ideas and values. And the Dolezal case, instead of like providing clarity, it just highlights how murky these waters really are.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that beyond the philosophical debate, there were also like practical concerns too, right?
Right. Like some people argued that Dolezal, by misrepresenting herself, she may have kind of compromised her work within the NAACP, an organization, of course, that's dedicated to fighting for racial justice.
Yeah, so did her actions, even if they were well-intentioned, ultimately undermine the very cause she claimed to champion. That's a question I think a lot of people were wrestling with.
It seems like that lack of consensus, the intense emotions, the unanswered questions, those are like the enduring legacies of the Rachel Dolezal case. It's a story that just continues to fascinate and provoke, even all these years later.
And maybe that's the point. Maybe by kind of grappling with the complexities of it, by allowing ourselves to be challenged by these, uncomfortable questions, we can maybe move toward a more nuanced and informed understanding of race, identity, and belonging in, this ever-evolving world.
So where does that leave us, like the listeners, in all of this? What are we supposed to, like, take away from this deep dive into the Dolezal case and this whole broader conversation about race and identity?
Well, I think it compels us to confront our own assumptions about race and identity, our views based on biology, on social constructs, or maybe like a combination of both. How much weight do we give to ancestry versus lived experience? I think those are questions worth pondering.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground here. I mean, we started with Dolezal's story, explored definitions of ethnicity, and we even delved into the science of, genetics and ancestry, all to try and understand this concept of transracial identity. And I mean, honestly, we've encountered more questions than answers along the way.
Yeah, but that's often the case with complex issues, isn't it? I mean, they challenge us to think critically and engage in meaningful dialogue rather than just seeking easy answers.
It's clear that the conversation about race and identity is far from over. And I think the Dolezal case served as this catalyst, forcing us to confront some of the most challenging aspects of this ongoing conversation.
And hopefully by listening to diverse perspectives and engaging in open and honest discussions, we can move towards a future where these issues are addressed with greater understanding and empathy.
Okay, so we've examined the criticisms and the defenses, the complexities and the contradictions. But there's another layer to this whole conversation that we haven't touched on yet. It's something that comes up in a few of our sources, and it relates to how the Dolezal situation compares to transgender identity.
Yeah, it almost feels like there's this parallel conversation happening around gender and race, but with very different conclusions being drawn.
Yeah, that's a really, really good observation. You're right. As a point that came up in a couple of our sources. For example, remember that Professor Dave Explains video, the one where he argues that gender identity is rooted in biology? Yeah, exactly. He's coming from a very scientific perspective, arguing that gender identity is this biological construct based on neurochemistry and genetics. He actually says that the phrase gender is a social construct is misleading and should be abandoned, which is so interesting because, when we talk about race, that very phrase social construct is often used to explain how, racial categories are shaped by societal forces, not just biology.
Right, right. And that leads to, well, a pretty fascinating and maybe controversial question, right? Like, if society is increasingly accepting this separation between gender identity and biological sex, could we see a similar shift in how we understand racial identity as distinct from ancestry?
Okay, so you're saying could there be a future where transracial becomes a recognized and accepted identity, just like transgender?
Yeah.
Could someone like Rachel Dolezal, in that future, be accepted as legitimately Black, even without the ancestry? I mean, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, and it's impossible to say for sure, what the future holds. But what we can say is that Dolezal's case, regardless of what people think about her actions, it's definitely fueled this crucial conversation. It's forced us to examine not only, our own beliefs, but also the larger societal structures that shape how we understand these things, race and identity.
Right. Like her story almost became this lightning rod attracting all these different viewpoints and
Yeah.
and forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we view race.
And to add another layer to that, remember that Wikipedia article on
Yeah.
race, human categorization?
Mm.
It pointed out how racial classifications have evolved throughout history, particularly in the U.S., and how these categories aren't fixed. They're fluid, subject to change based on social and political forces. Well, and it also highlighted that example of Brazil, where racial categories are way more fluid, more nuanced than in the U.S., right? Which is a good reminder that our own like societal framework for understanding race, it's not universal.
Exactly, exactly. So while the debate about transracial identity continues, one thing's for sure, this conversation isn't over. And as our understanding of genetics, neuroscience, all that progresses, who knows, maybe our understanding of both race and gender will continue to evolve in ways we can't even imagine right now.
Wow, this deep dive has been, well, quite the journey. We started with, the controversial case of Rachel Dolezal, explored, definitions of ethnicity, delved into, the science of gene editing and ancestry, and even navigated those often turbulent waters of social media, all those different viewpoints out there.
I know, right? And we encountered all these different viewpoints grappled with some tough questions. And honestly, I think we ended up with more food for thought than concrete answers.
But maybe that's the point of these deep dives, right? It's not always about reaching a definitive conclusion. It's about, challenging our assumptions, expanding our knowledge, and engaging in thoughtful conversations that push us to grow.
Really well said. So as you all continue to think about the case of Rachel Dolezal and this larger conversation about race and identity, remember the journey of learning, it's never truly over. There's always more to discover, more perspectives to consider, and more nuanced understandings to reach. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.